So my current thinking is more in terms of archetypal psychology, to see that what we're dealing with are sort of archetypal patterns, archetypal gestalt, and whether they will have a transpersonal expression or perinatal or biological, then would be a separate issue. But none of these three domains would be really supraordinated to any other. They would all be expressions of the archetypal. We have so far discussed new understanding of emotional psychosomatic disorders, which is quite interesting in itself. But what's quite exciting is that this new understanding also offers, completely new therapeutic strategies, new mechanisms of healing, of transformation, of consciousness evolution, which are not available as long as we think in terms of the old conceptual frameworks. And this is something that we'll explore in the next part. This new understanding of emotional and psychosomatic problems has also profound implications for therapy. It leads to a completely new philosophy and strategy in therapeutic work. A very essential part of it is the understanding of the nature, the content, and the meaning of symptoms. In traditional psychiatry, the symptoms are simply manifestations of a disease, a mental disease or emotional disorder, and the intensity of the symptoms is somehow an indication of the seriousness of the problem. So that when we do something to alleviate the symptoms, it is frequently presented as improvement. Let's say if we read the records of the nurses in the psychiatric ward, we'll read things like less anxious today, improving, less aggressive, more docile, and so on. So that the intensity of the symptoms is kind of a barometer of the seriousness of the disease. And much of kind of routine psychiatric treatment really has to do with symptomatic suppression. Fritjof Capra has a very interesting example of what this means as an approach to therapy. He asks people to imagine that they are driving a car, and they don't know very much about the car, but they know that if a red light comes on the dashboard, that's bad news, there's something wrong. And suddenly there's a red light on the dashboard, and it happens to be the light that's showing that the person is running out of oil. And let's say the person would take the car to the garage, and a mechanic would come and say, oh, red light, no problem, would kind of reach in and pull out the wire, and the red light disappears. He would say, no problem, you're fine. So we wouldn't have a very high opinion of a mechanic that would handle the problem in this way. We would like a mechanic that would keep the signaling system intact and do something with the car so that the light does not have to appear, but it could appear if it had a reason to appear. So in a very similar way, a real therapy would mean to maintain the signaling system intact, not to interfere with the possibility of symptoms manifesting, but create a situation where there is no need for the symptoms to emerge. Now, in comparison with this kind of an understanding of the symptoms that we have in traditional psychiatry, this new understanding that came out of the work with non-ordinary states could be called homeopathic. It has something to do with therapy that's basically energetic. It's work with energies. We now have a new development within medicine, kind of alternative development, which is called energy medicine. An example would be, beside homeopathy, Chinese medicine, where the idea is you want to be sure that the energies in the body are not blocked, that they are flowing. And if the energies are flowing, the body takes care of itself. So this approach is homeopathic in that the symptoms are not seen just as a nuisance, but also an opportunity. When a symptom appears, that means that the organism is trying to get rid of something. It's trying to free itself from some kind of traumatic imprint. And if it's a major trauma, it will be very dramatic as the symptom will be manifesting. In traditional psychotherapy, when we don't have, let's say, the concept of the perinatal or the transpersonal domain, if our thinking is limited to the biographical domain, we don't have really an adequate conceptual framework that would account for some extreme situations, like when people think that they are dying and they're choking, they experience violent impulses and so on. If we expand our conceptual framework to include the birth trauma, then the same kind of symptoms would appear absolutely natural. The organism is manifesting these symptoms because it's trying to free itself from a very, very serious traumatic imprint. So in homeopathy, the symptoms are seen as expressions of healing and not just expressions or manifestations of the disease. So the homeopathic strategy is to use some of the homeopathic remedies to actually intensify the presenting symptoms. So a homeopath would try to exactly identify the syndrome which the client is presenting and then find a remedy that in so-called proofing, which is when healthy people would take it, would produce those kinds of symptoms that the client has. And then the homeopathic remedy is given to intensify the symptoms, which means basically supporting what homeopathy would see as a healing process. When we get into a non-ordinary state, there's something like an inner radar which scans the system, which finds where the problem is, and it will intensify any existing problem, or it will bring into manifestation a symptom that previously was latent. So where in homeopathy we have to find the appropriate remedy, a non-ordinary state will simply intensify whatever the presenting symptoms are. And when these symptoms manifest, they actually get converted, they get transformed into a stream of experiences. And the whole process is kind of guided by inner healing intelligence. So the therapist in the situation then simply supports what is already happening with full trust that there is a deeper intelligence that is guiding the process. It's also important for the person who is involved in this therapeutic process to trust his or her own healing intelligence. Now, what we see when we approach the problem of emotional and psychosomatic disorders in this new way is that the roots of these disorders reach much deeper than traditional psychology or psychiatry believes, which might be kind of discouraging if it were not for the fact that we also discover new powerful mechanisms of healing and of transformation, which are not available as long as we think along the old lines. So in traditional psychotherapy, verbal psychotherapy, some of the mechanisms which are seen as associated with therapy would be efforts to remember some of the forgotten or repressed traumatic experiences from childhood, or to reconstruct them indirectly, let's say from dreams or from neurotic symptoms, reach what has been referred to as emotional and intellectual insights, project some of the old problems into the relationship with the therapist by the mechanism of transference, and create a transference neurosis, which is contaminating basically the relationship with the therapist by these old problems, and then through transference analysis trying to sort it out and correct it. There's one mechanism which I would mention here, which has kind of an ambiguous position in traditional psychiatry, which is abreaction, which means expression of emotions, release of emotions connected with some specific traumatic material, which is really not acknowledged in traditional psychotherapy, with the exception of one category of disorders, which is traumatic emotional neurosis, like people who start developing symptoms because of an exposure to a war or because they were in some kind of a natural catastrophe and so on. In those instances, abreaction is seen as something that can help, but there is a general tendency to discourage abreaction in general psychotherapy. Now, when we work with non-ordinary state, we get access, in addition to all these other mechanisms that are available in verbal therapy, we get access to many, many new mechanisms of healing. One of them, on the biographical level, is, for example, full reliving of traumatic events in age regression.